Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today, and when you're watching this yesterday, is the TTC's 100th anniversary. And so obviously I'm going to make a commemorative or celebratory video to talk about the best transit commission in Toronto, right? Well, I jest. I sometimes think that when we're talking about the TTC, and when the TTC gets talked about in urban circles, urbanist circles, transit circles, we highlight the wrong things. And I'm going to break down why in this video. Suffice to say though, the thing that everyone talks about with regard to the TTC and what makes it special is something that I think honestly isn't all that special. Well, on the other hand, the thing that I think truly makes the TTC stand out and one of a kind is something we barely talk about at all. So let's dive in. If you're not already, consider supporting the channel on Patreon for special perks and to help me make videos about transit agencies. The first thing that anyone talks about when the TTC or Toronto comes up in transit and urbanism circles is the streetcar. And frankly, the streetcar is to some extent a symbol of Toronto. You see it on murals, you see it on art about the TTC, whereas you rarely see art of the subway or the buses. It's also naturally where conversations lead. Oh yeah, Toronto kept its streetcars. Neat. And as expected, when the big birthday event happened yesterday, there were a ton of old-timey streetcars out that people got to, take a look at and reminisce about. But I think this highlights a lot of the reasons why the streetcar centricity of the Toronto transit/city discourse is so misguided. And it also gets to the core of a problem we have with transit systems often in North America. You see, I often think that Toronto streetcars are less of a win for transit in this city and more of a win for historical preservation. To be sure, streetcars have advantages over buses in some areas. I talked about it in this somewhat controversial video a few years ago about buses versus streetcars. But despite this theoretical edge, it doesn't seem like we really care in Toronto about making the streetcars good. It often feels like in Toronto, despite our sort of obsession with the streetcars and the way that they are sort of worshipped as a symbol of transit, we don't really care about them. We don't really treat them as we should if we think they're as important of a mode as they are. And I think that that might be a reflection that they're not necessarily the most useful mode, but it's obviously a reflection of the way that modern day Toronto is. It just sort of feels like that once we decided not to rip them out, we stopped caring about anything that differentiated them from buses. And what's that led to? Well, Toronto's streetcars are painfully slow. So slow that when they're replaced with buses, it's not uncommon to hear people saying, we should just keep the buses. Now, of course, the usual retort comes out that if you were to replace the streetcars with buses, you'd need way more buses, but that's not always true. A lot of the time, streetcars don't run all that often, or they run inconsistently, in which case, no, I don't think you would be seeing 3 buses for every streetcar. Yes, there are some routes during some times of the day where streetcars make a lot of sense, but there are other routes and places where I just wonder if the streetcar is really the transit solution we should be using. I think it's pretty clear that the streetcars often are used the same way that some transit agencies use articulated buses, and this is terrible. This is something I didn't realize was even a thing until I moved to the Greater Toronto region, where a certain transit operator does this with articulated buses, but sometimes the larger vehicle is just an excuse to run the vehicle less frequently, and so it is surprising how infrequent some of the streetcar routes are. Now, of course, part of the reason for that is that the TTC doesn't have enough streetcars. And we didn't even have modern streetcars until just a few years ago. But that's part of the problem. If the streetcar was as important as I think we pretend it is, then we would be upgrading every few years and buying new streetcars and having a very large fleet of vehicles and adding new routes more frequently and the like. It just feels like the streetcar is a system we have and we feel almost stuck with it. Like we're not trying to expand it. We're not really investing as heavily in vehicles as it seems like we should if these are the incredibly important piece of transit infrastructure for the city that we often treat them as they are. I mean, think about it. We had these late 20th century streetcars until a year or two ago. We didn't in the middle decide like, let's expand the fleet with 30 new streetcars like a place like Melbourne would. We instead waited until things were so terribly bad that they were just inexcusable, and then finally we made the leap. And I just think that that's not the approach you take with something that you care about and with something that you value. If Toronto's committed to the streetcar, it just certainly doesn't feel like it with our policy decisions, and that's even from places that are hypothetically pro-streetcar. It's all reflected in the underinvestment and the weird decisions we make about these quirky vehicles. And I think it's reflected in things like the fact that you don't see right-of-way in that many places. Yes, Spadina and St. Clair have right-of-way, but surely there are other places on the network where we could be working on right-of-way, but we're just not. There could be new service patterns introduced. Again, more new vehicles, other new ideas. We just feel so afraid to touch this concept that obviously needs to be updated for the modern times. We just seem so afraid to change or update this old-fashioned transit mode to, be with the times. I mean, the streetcars are just constantly stuck in traffic, and yes, in many cases they also do disrupt traffic. Having right-of-way seems like such a common sense thing, and I just don't know why we don't do it more extensively. We certainly could. Another thing I brought up in previous videos is the fact that we don't have really nice streetcar stops. We have LRT lines which are being built, which for all intents and purposes are not really different from the right-of-way streetcar lines, and yet we build all of these features into these light rail lines that we could easily add onto the streetcar lines at a fairly low cost and seriously enhance the experience. Level boarding, for example, or green track. These would be great things to see on the streetcar network, but there doesn't even seem to be any interest in trying to do anything like that. And I suppose most fundamentally, while the streetcars are a symbol of Toronto and they're something that a lot of Torontonians hold dearly and are nostalgic about, I don't think they actually represent something that Toronto has to offer the world. They're not really particularly unique for a tram system. I mean, lots of cities have tram systems, and let's be honest, most cities with extensive tram systems have better tram systems than Toronto. They have better, more modern vehicles, they're more liberal with the right-of-way and with modern features, and they have nicer stops. Not all systems, but not many cities are spending as much and talking as much about how transit is important and how we have to improve transit as Toronto is, and so it's this weird disconnect. It often feels like the only real contribution the Toronto streetcar network has to the transit discourse is that it's a streetcar network. It's certainly the world's largest streetcar network, but what else does it really offer? As feels typical in my, 5 to 6 years in Toronto, we have something that isn't necessarily all that unique that we sort of cherish. Well, we have something that is truly unique, but sort of mundane that we totally ignore. What could I be talking about? Well, if you watch the channel regularly, you know. It's the Toronto bus system. The buses are the single greatest thing we have done in Toronto with transit in my eyes, and it is the single greatest success of the TTC. It is a massive success. The TTC is, for all of its problems, masterful at buses. While there are a lot of cities with great bus systems, Hong Kong, London, Bogota, there is no city that combines such an apparently incompatible with transit urban form with incredibly successful transit. Don't get me wrong, I love the streetcar and I love the subway, but I love them in a I'm fond of this and I've taken this home after long days of work way, not in a I'm impressed by this or this is unique way. The subway and the streetcar are nice, but let's be honest, they're not special. They're like every other subway and tram system out there, and in many ways they're worse. They have a unique gauge, but that isn't actually something that I think differentiates the system. That was for the rail fans out there. Much like with the streetcar, the subway we have doesn't feel modern in a lot of ways. And in the same way that the streetcars sort of have successes that we allow to get marred by other policies we have in the city, the subway is incredibly successful, especially on Yonge Street, and yet we don't invest in longer trains or CBTC, 10, 15 years ago, because CBTC has been a thing for a long time. We don't invest in massive station upgrades the way that cities like Vancouver and Montreal have been doing, at least not at the same scale. So it just feels like these are not the things that we care about, despite them seemingly being the most substantial pieces of transit infrastructure. On the other hand, the buses of Toronto are mind-boggling, and I think it took me being back in suburban Toronto, living here for a few months, away from the subway, to really remind me that the buses have their problems, but they are incredible. For my home in suburban Toronto, I have the option to go in 4 different directions on a handful of different routes, with buses that are every 5 to 10 minutes from 5 a.m. to 1 a.m. at night. And even in the overnight periods, there's a bus going by my place every 15 minutes. It's amazing. There's something so incredible about this frequency and this level of mobility and connectivity that cities, many times Toronto's size, can't offer, especially at night, and yet Toronto manages to offer that in its suburbs. And I mean, the system has fixed one of the biggest problems in transit that we face, which is that time waiting for a vehicle is perceived as much worse than traveling on a vehicle itself. And the Toronto bus system just hits this nail on the head. You get to a stop and the bus is there usually incredibly quickly. And even if the trip takes a long time, you're always moving. A 15-minute wait, even on a suburban street surrounded by strip malls and industrial land, would be unimaginable in most areas of Toronto. And that combination of multiple routes as well as local and express services makes the buses feel in some ways like a subway. I remember taking trips across the suburbs where I've taken 3 different buses, and it wasn't impractical because upon getting off of my bus, I'm quickly greeted with another one that takes me in a totally different direction. You just don't have to wait very long. The buses come consistently. I remember in Vancouver in high school waiting for buses that were, a 30-minute headway, and they were, sometimes they would take 40 minutes because they were so inconsistent. In Toronto, you go to a stop and a bus is going to show up, and there's a certain concern you have in other places where, you go to a stop and you sort of wonder, like, is the bus ever going to come? Am I going to be stranded? It's a fear I've just never had in Toronto. It's probably because there are so many buses that you're going to see them going in both directions, and there's just a presence on the street. It's incredible. You could take a bus ride for 20 minutes and going in the other direction see 10, 15 buses. It's crazy. And that's with the buses being treated much the same as the streetcar and subway. Despite being so successful, we don't really reinvest. We have okay buses. Our new buses look aesthetically okay, and they have LCD interior screens finally, but there's so much that we have to improve. Our buses are not that comfortable. We could probably use more models that sort of cater to different styles of routes. We could better utilize those LCD displays instead of just showing the same stuff that's on the LED ones that preceded them, but now on a bigger screen. We could do way more signal priority. Dedicated lanes all over the place, and not just dedicated lanes, but nicer stops at the major stops. Toronto is incredible for its ability to have literally over 1 million bus riders a day, and yet we don't really have like a BRT light system with enhanced stops and things like that. Seriously, if the TTC wants to get me to be its consultant on making the bus system like 50% better, for not that much effort, I would be happy to. There's just so many little things we could do that would take this honestly incredible suburban transit system and make it just unbelievably good. So good that I could spend the rest of my life just making videos about the numerous bus routes we have here. And yet, despite all of this, when you bring up the buses in Toronto, it's amazing how many people don't really treat them differently than the buses in other cities. I still get looks like, you took the bus to work today? Or looks like, oh, like, I like transit, but I wouldn't ride, as far as you do all the time on the buses. Or, really, are the buses that good? It's amazing to me that even in Toronto and in the transit community, we have such a gem here in Toronto and we don't appreciate it. It's sort of like the light metro systems of cities like Copenhagen and Vancouver. Another topic you folks know I love to talk about. What I'm saying is that systems like those light metros and the Toronto bus system show you that something that conventional wisdom tells you is impossible, like having an affordable metro system that can cost similar amounts to light rail while doing all the things a full metro system does. In the same way, you can have an incredibly great transit system in a desolate suburban area, and that can sort of be the thing that starts your change and that gets people using transit and then leads you to have demand for things like dedicated lanes and the like, things that the TTC is doing, thankfully. Given the urgency of climate change, and it has been truly horrifying in the past few days, the images coming out from literally around the world, we need to move people onto transit as quickly as possible. And the beautiful thing is, Toronto and the TTC have exactly the model that can do it, that can be deployed in so many places, particularly in North America, where we don't necessarily have the answers for transit in heavy infrastructure that takes a long time to build and is very expensive. I don't know. And in my eyes, in the past 100 years, the TTC's ability to create this bus system that is honestly one of the best in the world, that's its greatest achievement. And at least for its 100th birthday, that's what I've been thinking about a lot. The streetcars are nice, but they don't have anything on the buses. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.